So, over the last few weeks we've been looking at a really important and influential text called the Bodhicaryavatara, the guide to the path to awakening. And we've seen that this describes the path of the Bodhisattva, the person who's seeking to become enlightened, not just for their own sake, but for the sake of the world, to be of use to the world. And we've seen that this text is structured around the most common of the formulations of the Bodhisattva path, which is called the Six Paramitas. Paramita means something like perfection. Well, it's often translated as perfection, but there's a sort of alternative translation, which certainly Dr. Konza, one of the great translators of Sanskrit text, favors, which is that it means to the other shore. It means something that takes us to the other shore, so something that takes us beyond. So the six practices that take us beyond the limited person we are now, the six practices that allow us to transcend. I haven't got a flip chart, but they are ethics, generosity, patient forbearance, putting up with things, virya, energy and effort, meditation and wisdom. And last week we heard from Mokshitara and Maitrivasin about meditation. So this week I'm going to talk about the wisdom chapter of the Bodhicaryavatara. So listen up, because tonight we're going to hear the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. But unfortunately, there seems to be quite a consensus that it is impossible to understand this chapter. It's quite a long chapter. Most of it seems to be Santideva arguing with people coming from a lot of different philosophical viewpoints that were very important at the time, including some different Buddhist philosophical viewpoints that we don't even know what they are. So what we've got is one side of an argument where we don't know what the other side is all about, so we can't understand what he's on about. So that's a shame, so I'm off. Well, maybe not. However, amongst all these arguments that we don't really understand, there is a core that we can understand. And it's this core that I've tried to put into this little booklet that we've been giving out. And it's this core that I'm going to try to talk about tonight. And this core is mainly about a concept called anatman, which is often translated as non-self, and a concept called Sunyata, which is usually translated as emptiness, literally means emptiness. So an-atman, I could do with a flip chart, but I haven't got one, never mind. An-atman. An is a negative prefix, so not. Atman is a Hindu-Indian term meaning a spotless, pure, unchanging, eternal soul, a pure essence, in each of which is unchanging and independent of everything around us, which passes from life to life. The Britannica defines it as the universal self, identical with the core of the personality. Another online thing says the supreme self, which is immortal and ever changeless and independent of outer phenomena. It's also said to be an aspect of God, an aspect of Brahma in each individual, which over lifetimes returns to God, returns to Brahma. So, an is a negative prefix. So what anatman actually means is there is no atman. No unchanging essence within us that just never changes and which exists completely on its own right. It's a standalone thing, completely independent of other things. That's what it means. No atman. It does not mean no self, but it's always translated as no self. And this confusion arises because, as I say, because Atman is often translated as self, because in Indian philosophy there is an assumption that the only sort of self that's worth having remotely is a self that's immortal, and a self which doesn't change, and a self which is completely standalone and independent of everything else. That's the sort of self you want, so that's what a self is. And anything other than that is not worth calling a self. That seems to be the assumption in that tradition. So anything that changes, anything which is affected by the world around it, can't be a self. It's not a proper self. That can't be a self. So according to that tradition, Atman and self are the same thing, so we translate an Atman as non-self and think it means we don't have a self. But what it really means is we don't have an Atman. We don't have an inner essence that never changes and which is completely standalone and nothing ever affects it. So it doesn't mean we don't have a self, it means we don't have a self that's unchanging and independent. And actually, I'm going to suggest that we do have a self, and I'll say more about this later. We do have a self in a way, or something that we can think of as self, but that self is constantly changing, completely connected and interdependent with the world around us, and really important that we pay attention to it. So a little bit of background to this, So an Atman is one of the three lakshanas, one of the three marks of conditioned existence, which was a sort of fundamental teaching of the historical Buddha, and which we talk about on our introductory night. The three marks of conditioned things. Anatta, impermanence, everything is in flux, everything is changing. An Atman that we've been talking about, and dukkha, the idea that impermanent conditioned things can't give us real satisfaction. So in our newcomers course, we sort of present these in a slightly unusual way as we can change impermanence. We are interconnected, an Atman. And happiness comes from inside, dukkha, the idea that external things can't give us satisfaction. So, just to go into those a little bit more, because they're the important background to this chapter. The Buddha taught that all things are impermanent, okay? Transient. Some things change really quickly, like our minds. Our thoughts, some a bit more slowly, like the weather, although it doesn't seem to change very quickly here at the moment. The seasons, our bodies as we grow up and then grow old. And some things change really slowly, or it seems really slowly to us because we change really quickly. There might be beings out there for whom things like the geology of the country change really quickly, and we just don't even know they're there. But we change really quickly, so we think they change really slowly. But like the earth we live on, the hills and valleys and so forth. So out in the Peak District, you can go for a walk on a hill, which is a huge accumulation of seashells that were laid down at the bottom of a tropical sea. Heaven knows how long ago. And they were then buried so deep in the earth they were turned into limestone. And then they were pushed up so high they became an enormous mountain range. And then they were ground down by glaciers until they were sort of rounded hills we see today. And we can go out for a walk on them and pick up fossils from those seas all those years ago. So it's all, even that is changing. Even that is changing. So that's the first mark of things. Everything is in a process of change. As well as that, the Buddha taught that all things lack this permanent, independent essence, an Atman. They lack an Atman. All things are part of this great process of conditioned co-production, constantly interacting with everything around them. So not only do all things change, there is only change. There is only a process of change. In our introductory course, we sometimes use the analogy of things, us, being like an eddy or a whirlpool in a stream, in a river. So an eddy or a whirlpool in a river has got a certain entity, it's got a certain it's got a certain sort of existence, it's got a certain constant, a certain sort of shape. but it's constantly changing, and it completely cannot be separated from the waters around it. It's constantly interacting with all the waters around it. And we're like that. We have a certain stability for a while, but we exist in an interaction with everything around us. We can't be separated from the world around us. We're the water we swim in. That's an Atman. We don't have this independent essence separate from the world around us. So that's the two of the marks. And the third one is dukkha, unsatisfactoriness. The fact that because everything is constantly changing, because nothing has the sort of essential nature that we ascribe to it, outer conditioned things cannot really satisfy us. Not with any degree of permanence. They can't give us happiness. So in the tradition that Santideva, in the Mahayana tradition that Santideva came from, these three lakshanas tend to get sort of lumped together under the single term Sunyata, which literally means emptiness. Things, we ourselves, are empty in the sense that we're empty of a permanent, unchanging essence, and empty in the sense that nothing can give us a real satisfaction. But maybe a bit more than that, and I'll go into that later as well. So in his chapter on wisdom, Shantideva sets out to convince us of the truth of an Atman. He sets out to get us to see that we don't have this permanent, independent essence. We don't have a self in the Indian sense of having a self. We have to remember that he is coming from that point of view. So I'm going to use the word self as he uses it, but remember that's a particular definition of a self. That self has to be permanent and independent. So he's talking that way. So his language can seem extreme. He can seem to be telling us that not just that we don't have a self, but that we don't really exist, or that even that nothing really exists. Anyway, so he sets out to persuade us of the truth of an Atman. And he does this in two ways, and Sangha actually characterizes these two ways as spatio-analytical and temporal synthetic. Kinetic, oh, okay, I thought it was synthetic. Doesn't matter. Two ways. In one of them, he divides things up into their bits, so temporal. And so it's an analysis in the sense that it's dividing things up. So that's the first one. He divides things up and says, okay, where in all of that is this Atman? Where is this essential nature we're looking for? Where in all of that is this essential nature? So you can't find it, so it doesn't exist. So he says, just as the trunk of a banana tree is shown to be empty of real existence when it is broken down into its separate parts, apparently banana trees don't have a trunk, they're just loads and loads of leaves. So if you look for it, you just tear all the leaf sheaths off and you're not left with anything. So just as a banana tree is shown to be empty of real existence when it's broken down into its separate parts, in the same way we see that the self is not a real entity when we hunt for it by analysis. The teeth, hair and nails are not I, nor are the bones, blood, mucus, pus or lymph, thank heavens. Marrow is not I, nor are the sweat, fat, entrails, excrement or urine. The flesh is not I, nor the sinews, nor any of the elements that make up the body. And even these constituents can be analysed down to atoms, and then these atoms too can be broken down until we are just left with empty space. The body is not in its parts, nor does it exist separately from the parts. Who, analysing the body like this, would take delight in a form that is like a dream? So we divide the body up and say, well, where's the self in that? Well, there isn't one. Now, do you find that convincing? No. I don't find that convincing. Complex things like human beings are more than the sum of their parts, okay? You couldn't predict Shakespeare's imagination or Mozart's musical ability by chopping them up into bits and looking at the bits. their qualities only come about when you put all the bits together and put them in a particular, as a human being, and put the bits in a particular environment. So there's a word for that in modern systems theory, which is emergence. So when simpler things come together within more complex organized systems, new qualities emerge. Shakespeare's imagination emerged from the union of quite a lot of things. It could never have been predicted from the individual things. So Shakespeare's dramatic genius, Mozart's musical ability were emergent properties which you couldn't find by chopping them up into bits. But that doesn't mean they don't exist. So I hate, in a way, to differ from Santideva in any way, who is much wiser than I don't doubt. But I think this is a case of a flawed argument being used to put forward a truth, actually, to prove a valid point. We don't exist in the hard and fast way we normally think we do. That's true, but personally I don't think that chopping us up into bits proves that logically. However, I do think the temporal, I think synthetic, but it might be kinetic, temporal synetic argument makes a lot more sense. This is looking at things in terms of time instead of space, and it's looking at things in terms of how they're connected and how they interact, rather than in terms of chopping them up into bits, so synthetic. So he talks about how everything changes and how everything is radically transient, and also about how everything exists in dependence on everything else. So in terms of how everything changes, he says, this stream, actually we've got this here, this stream of mental, it's always on this lectern, this stream of mental moments I call my mind, these ever-changing elements I call my body, are not some separate thing that exists in its own right. That's one quote. Another is, the past mind and the future mind can't be I, because they don't exist. But if the present mind is I, then the so-called self vanishes as soon as the present moment of consciousness has passed. In fact, the sense of a continuous self is an illusion caused by memory. What happened earlier in time is remembered by what arose later, but this does not mean that the earlier and later selves are the same. Elsewhere he says something like, well, it's not like firewood turns into ashes. It's not like there's some, you burn something. It's not like it's the same thing. And then he talks about how everything exists in dependence on everything else. So he says, the existence of any phenomenon depends on a complex set of causes. Nothing exists separately from its causes, and the constantly changing phenomena of the conditioned world have no continuous identity. This is it. The past cause and the future effect are not the same thing, any more than rice and dung are the same thing. So the me I am now causes the me I am later, but in what way are they the same thing? Any more than rice and dung, apparently. So Shantideva is asking us to take a radical and even a rather shocking look at the way we really exist, to sort of bump us out, knock us out of our normal idea that we have this sort of essential I, some inner core that is me. And I've said that what he's talking about is we don't have an Atman, we don't have an Atman. That's very confusing. And I'll come back to that. But the fact is that most of us, probably deep down, do have quite a strong sense that we do have something like this Indian idea of an Atman. We probably think there's some sort of core of me, which is unchanging and essential and essentially me and different from everybody else's. So reflecting in this way can free us up from a way of seeing ourselves which just isn't true, and which traps us in a sort of prison of egocentricity, of focusing on me. So hopefully you've been convinced, at least by the temporal synthetic argument. when he's hopefully convinced us in that way that we don't have this essential, unchanging, standalone core. And I think we can probably prove that to ourselves. We think about what we've been in the past, the way we change all the time, the way we're constantly we're not some fixed thing, we're constantly taking in stuff from the outer world and giving it back, constantly changing. We're a process, a bit like that eddy in a stream that I talked about. But so he then takes on a couple of objections to the idea of an Atman that people might come up with, and people still do come up with, actually, although they come up with them in a different form. So firstly, he says, well, people will argue if there isn't a self, how can we be reborn? How can we be reborn if there isn't a self? That's pretty easy to refute. I mean, there's no reason why a changing stream of psychophysical energy, as Sangharakshita puts it, there's no reason why that shouldn't be reborn, no more reason why that shouldn't be reborn than an unchanging self should be reborn. It's interesting that it's the other way around today. So then it was, well, an Atman can't be true because rebirth is. And today it's often rebirth can't be true because an Atman is. So people will say, well, if there's no self, how can there be rebirth? And the objection to the Buddha's time was the opposite way around. Anyway, never mind. Secondly, he says, well, some people will say, if there's no self, then that invalidates the law of karma. How can you have karma? The law of karma tells us that skillful actions lead to future happiness, future benefit. Unskillful actions lead to future suffering. But if there's no self to experience the results of karma, then it's all nonsensical. How can that be? And again, that's fairly easy to refute. So what he says is, some people argue that if there is no self, then the law of karma is invalidated, because the doer of an action and the experiencer of the result are not the same self. But the one who provides the cause and the one who experiences the results are linked by a continuity of consciousness. He is at least admitting that. Are linked by a continuity of consciousness. There is no need to assume some permanent, independently existing self for karma to operate. And in fact, if you believed in an Atman, you couldn't have karma. Okay? So karma is about how we change and grow and transform. And if we had an unchanging self, we wouldn't. So karma and an Atman absolutely depend on each other. So as I've said, in Shantideva's Mahayana, so that's a couple of objections. There might be more, but that's a couple of objections. Anyway, as I said, in Shantideva's Mahayana tradition, this idea of an Atman is very linked to what is called Sunyata. Sunyata literally means emptiness, I believe. And this emptiness implies it includes the three lakshanas, non-self, impermanence and unsatisfactoriness, but it sort of gets extended beyond that to imply a certain sort of insubstantiality to things. So Shantideva tells us that all the states of conditioned existence are like dreams. He tells us that the things we see around us are like the shapes we see in clouds. So we attribute some sort of reality to these shapes, but they're just coming into being, passing away with no real substance to them. He likens our experience to a magical show in which nothing is really real. So I'm sort of reminded in this sort of insubstantiality of that speech from Shakespeare. It's the Tempest, isn't it? Like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made of. So that's expressing something very, very similar. Okay, so seeing this emptiness, this shunyata, this insubstantiality and an Atman, it could all sound quite negative, or even a bit nihilistic. depressing. But Santideva makes a point of telling us how actually seeing the truth of Anatman and the truth of Sunyata is the key to spiritual progress and the key to, in fact, happiness, the real key to happiness. And he talks about this in two ways. So he talks, first of all, he says seeing Sunyata is liberating. It's liberating. And the reason it's liberating is because normally we are like people sort of seeing shapes in clouds and thinking they're real and thinking there's a melodrama going on in that cloud and then getting really upset about it and frightened about it or really wanting things that are happening in that cloud. There's just shifting shapes, insubstantial shapes. Or we're like people in a dream. We all have this experience. We're like people in a dream who, well, I really want that in a dream, but in what sense is it real? Or I'm really terrified of that in a dream, but none of it's real. None of it's real. We're like that. We're just constantly sort of like people in a dream. And I think it's sort of noteworthy that the Buddha is described as the awakened. So it's like we're dreaming, running away from dream monsters, running towards dream wonderful things. And the Buddha's going, what are they like? So if we see Anatman, we sort of see this. We see this and we're liberated from it. So he says, he describes the state of people who don't see Anatman. He said, my fellow humans do not see that everything is empty and open like space. Mesmerized by conditioned phenomena, one minute they are angry and the next they are celebrating. They are tormented by grief, worry, and despair. Constantly seeking their own happiness, they behave in unskillful ways, harming each other and causing suffering to themselves and others. So that's his take on what it's like to be deluded, to not see the truth of this. On the other hand, he says, the concept of Sunyata frees us from bondage to conditioned phenomena. And then we are liberated even from Sunyata by realizing that it itself does not really exist. When the mind grasps at no objects, neither as truly existing entities nor as non-entities, then it becomes tranquil. Without Sunyata, the mind is fettered and becomes trapped in cycles of continual re-arising. So yes, he sort of he expresses that earlier actually in the book, where he talks about the way our mind could be, or the way our mind in fact should be rather. He says the mind should be unshakable as a great mountain, knowing the world to be like a magical display, full of serene confidence, calm, eager to help others, unwearied by the conflicting desires of the spiritually immature, knowing that they are like this because they are possessed by the kleshas. So, unshakable, he's saying that if we really see this Sunyata, if we really see the insubstantial nature of things, we'll be unshakable as a great mountain, or our mind will be unshakable as a great mountain, knowing the world to be like a magical display. So, seeing Sunyata would be liberating. But in case we get the idea that seeing Sunyata means that we sort of don't care about anything anymore, that we, it's all just dreams, clouds, who cares, they can get on with it, those what do you call them, the foolish or whatever, let them get on with it. We'll just vanish onto an ivory tower and enjoy the bliss of nirvana. In case we think that's what's going on, he gives us a completely different take on it as well. Which, given that my computer taught me a lesson actually, it refused to print my talk or to send it to the Buddhist Centre, which I'm trying to sort of deal with by having my mind like a great mountain, untroubled by all events. So I'm going to have to spend a little bit of time finding my various quotes. So yes, he says, what does he say? So he sort of likens, so he makes the point that this vision of Sunyata comes along with a sense of complete solidarity and compassion for other beings. It can't be separated from it. And he uses an analogy. He uses an analogy which is, he compares, he talks about our body. So he uses the analogy of our body, and he says, well, the limbs of our body, they're all part of the same thing. So if we have a thorn in our foot, it's not as though our hand thinks, well, the thorn's in the foot, it can look after itself. We don't think twice about our hand taking the thorn out of our foot, because all of our limbs are part of the same body. And if we see things truly, then we'll see that all beings are limbs of the universe, if you like. All beings are limbs of the universe. So he says, just as I love and cherish my body, which is divided into many limbs, so I should love and cherish this whole world, which is divided into many beings. So he's using that sort of analogy. He's presenting this image, this vision of this complete connectedness of things, where it's not just that we're liberated, but we see this total connectedness, and we see our complete dependence, same nature actually as others, and we live from that. So he says, excuse me, those whose very nature is compassion see the whole world as identical with themselves. So this vision, if we see that that everything depends on everything else, we see that everything is connected with everything else. We see that everything is in a way part of everything else. We see that everyone is in a way part of everyone else. And that comes along with the vision of Sunyata. So the vision of Sunyata can't be something which leads us to just want to vanish into an ivory tower of nirvana. It must come along with a burning desire to actually be of benefit, to help others, compassion, solidarity with others. The two are completely integrated. They're completely the same thing. So, yeah, Sangharakshita has said, well, the idea of a individualistic enlightenment or individualistic insight into the nature of things is complete nonsense. Couldn't happen. Couldn't happen. So, personally, I'm pretty convinced that seeing the world in that way would be a serious step forward in wisdom, that it would be liberating, that it would go along with a real sense, a strong sense of solidarity with others, a strong sense of love for others, a real sense of just wanting to be of use in the world, wanting to help others. I think that's all true. I think it's all true that we don't have a self in the way that we normally think we have a self. And that, but could that perhaps be a little bit one-sided? Okay. So particularly, could the sort of normal way that we interpret non-self, or the way that if we think that our Buddhist practice is all about us achieving non-self, could that be a bit one-sided? Especially if we have the sort of understanding of non-self that people often seem to have in the West. And particularly if we take the language of non-self literally. And I say that because Anatman doesn't mean non-self. It means no Atman. We do have a self. We have a self which changes and is connected to others and the world around us, intimately connected to others and the world around us. And it's yeah, we do have a self, and so we have certain characteristics that sort of stay the same over time, you know, and they change eventually, but they are there. There's a certain atmosphere to us, there's certain gifts to us. I'm different from you. If you started suddenly acting and speaking like me, your friends and family would be really surprised. And vice versa, actually. So there's a sense in which we do have a self. And there's a sense in which that self is really important. The Buddha often tells his followers, you know, be strong, be determined, be courageous. These are things that come from a strong sense of self. It's really important to us that we take our own spiritual development and spiritual health seriously. It's really important that we take our accumulation of karma seriously, that we seek to produce good karma and not produce bad karma. That's really important. We're not going to get anywhere without that. The Dharma tells us we need to take ethical decisions. We need to make ethical decisions. That means we need to use what we might call willpower. We need to say, no, I'm not doing that. What I'm conditioned to do, I'll do that instead. We can't be in a gap unless we take ethical decisions. We need to be active agents in our own lives, and that requires a sense of self. So we're not going to get anywhere without it. I mean, as I said, the Buddha tells his followers to be strong selves, and Sangha tells us that we need to develop as individuals. We need to become what he calls true individuals, able to make our own decisions, autonomous, not pushed around by what everybody else thinks, thinking for ourselves, deciding for ourselves. We need to be able to put up with some dukkha, some unsatisfactoriness, to be able to be in the gap, to be able to live well. We need a strong sense of self. Sangha even goes so far as to say that if we think we don't have a soul, we have shot ourselves in the foot, spiritually speaking. By soul, he doesn't mean Atman. He doesn't mean something, a sort of eternal soul. But I think he means, there are patterns to our thinking and feeling. There's a certain sort of atmosphere to us. I mean, do you notice that people have a certain sort of atmosphere about them, a taste to them? We've all taste a bit different, don't we? We've all got a bit of a different atmosphere. And we've got heights and depths. And it's important that we've all got our inner worlds. If we think we're no inner world, we just make ourselves machines and then we're done for. So it's really important that we take account of the fact that we've got a self. It's really important that we don't interpret an Atman to mean that we are just totally conditioned. You could sort of interpret it like that. We don't have a self. What we are is just these conditioned beings totally sort of pushed around by conditions. And I actually know people, I know at least one person, who takes the view that because of an Atman, they have no free will. So they don't have to make ethical decisions because they can't. Because they're just conditioned. They're just conditioned. Absolutely deadly spiritually to think that way. We have to have this sense that we have free will. And part of what our practice is to extend the extent of our free will. We don't have complete free will. There are things about myself that I can't change, etc. But I've got certain choices. And the more I exercise those choices, the more what a friend of mine called our karmic window expands. Some people have got very, very small karmic windows, or very little free choice. Some people have got much more. And part of our spiritual practice is to make much more karmic window, much bigger. And that's growing ourself. That's growing ourself and our sense of independent action. Agency. So we have a sort of, what do we have? We have run out of notes. We have a sort of, we have a sort of bit of a conundrum, don't we? So is our spiritual life about forgetting ourselves, being about others, being about other things, just sort of going beyond the self, forgetting ourselves? Or is our spiritual life about developing ourselves, becoming true individuals, strong individuals with strong sort of sense of will and strong? Which one is it? There seems to be a complete how do you do that? Well, okay, I found something quite helpful in a book a long while ago about this. A book by a guy called Arthur Koestler, a thinker called Arthur Koestler. And he coined a phrase which is a bit of a mouthful, but I'm going to quote it anyway. And he said that we, actually, all things are what he called Janus-faced holons. Okay, mouthful, I'll explain. Okay, so Janus was a Roman god. And Janus was a Roman god with two faces that faced in different directions, okay? He was the god of doorways, thresholds, boundaries, portals between realms, etc. And he had these two faces, always shown with two faces. And I think what Koestler is saying is that we are like that. Everything is like that. Everything has a certain sort of self, and it's part of a bigger sort of self. A certain sort of self, and it's part of something which transcends it. And everything is Janus-faced, and everything is what he calls a holon. A holon is a way of getting around using the word self, because he's saying, well, it's sort of a whole, but it's sort of not a whole. So it's a holon, okay? So everything is a Janus-faced holon, okay? And I quite like this. So he says, well, so take a cell in your body. Okay? So a cell in your body has got a certain sort of self, self. It gets on with it. You don't have to pay it any attention. It just gets on with doing its cell things. You can even take it out and grow it in a culture medium, and it will sort of get on with doing its cell thing. So it's got a certain sort of cellish self. But it's part of a bigger thing. It's part of an organ. And it needs to look after itself, but it's got a higher purpose, which is to be part of this organ and serve this organ. And if it doesn't do that, then it either becomes useless or positively cancerous. And then, so it's part of an organ, and maybe that organ's the heart. So you could take the organ. Well, the heart's got a certain sort of entity. It gets on and does heart things without us knowing about it, thank heavens, because if we had to concentrate, if we lost mindfulness, we'd be goners. So it just gets on with being a heart. You can even take it out of us and put it in somebody else, and it will carry on being a heart. But at the same time, so it's got a higher purpose. So we really hope that our heart looks after itself. We want our heart to be the biggest, strongest heart that it can be. We really don't want it to sort of get weak. We hope it looks after itself. We hope it's a good heart. Its heart self is good and strong. But it's got a higher purpose, which is to serve us. And if it stops serving us, it ceased to have its higher purpose. And then, so it's got two faces. It's made of cells. It's itself made of cells, and it's part of something bigger, a part of a system which is a higher system. It's got a higher level of being, me. And then we, each of us, is part of something bigger. Now, we could say, okay, it's fairly obvious we're part of a society and a part of an ecosystem, but those sort of exist on the same level as us. We don't exist to serve them. We're in a mutual benefit interaction with them. They're all worldly. We want to be responsible within those, but we don't exist to serve our society like ants or... But I would argue that as spiritual beings, we're also part of something, or we're only truly fulfilled when we live in relationship to something which transcends our level of being in the same way that we transcend the level of being of our heart. And even to serve that, and you could describe that, if you like, as the bodhicitta. The enlightened mind, that if we're going to be truly human, truly what we could be, that we won't just be looking after ourselves, which we need to do, and ourselves spiritually will also be living in relationship to something higher than ourselves. And I think that's really well illustrated by the image of the thousand-armed Avalokiteshvara, which probably a lot of you have seen. So the thousand-armed Avalokiteshvara, he has 1,000 arms, not surprisingly, each of which is a hand offering something to the world. And the idea is that these hands are individuals, actually. They're individuals united in offering different gifts to the world, helping the world in different ways. But two of Avalokiteshvara's hands are held together at his heart. And they're holding a jewel, which represents what's called the bodhicitta, the enlightened mind. And so what unites all these hands is that they're all acting from the bodhicitta. They're all, in a way, serving this higher level of the bodhicitta. And I think that could be quite a good image of this dichotomy between, well, on the one hand, we need to be a strong individual, and on the other hand, we need to be an aspect serving in relationship to something higher than ourselves. Because there's not much, so it's great, Shantideva's telling us, well, be a hand of Avalokiteshvara. Get beyond the self and be part of something bigger, serving something bigger, serving the universe as part of this response to the bodhicitta, the enlightened mind. But there's not much point in being a hand of Avalokiteshvara if we're a really sort of weak, wimpy hand, is there? I mean, so we need to be a strong hand. We need to be a strong hand of Avalokiteshvara, as magnificent a hand as we can be. And we need to be offering our gifts. We need to have developed our gifts so that we have actually got something to offer as a hand. So we need to be doing both. We need to be doing both. We need to be both concerned with ourselves, concerned to be an individual, concerned to develop ourselves spiritually and to develop our talents as well. And we need to be seeing ourselves as not some independent standalone thing, but as something which exists in dependence on everything else and which is in a way serving everything else. Okay, so I hope that's given you a sense of this completely unintelligible chapter. And I hope that maybe I've given us some ideas about what Shantideva's getting at, and also some of the ways we could misinterpret it, because I think it's quite frequently misinterpreted. So anyway, thank you.